Hey, what's up, expats and travelers alike? I'm Josh with Expats Everywhere, and welcome to our channel. Today we have a great interview for you guys about Mexico. We talked to the owner of Expats in Mexico, and he goes over three main things. One, he talks about how he gets started as an expat in Mexico. Two, he talks about some great tips on how to transition to Mexico as an expat. And three, he goes over some key cities that expats should check out to live in. Hope you guys enjoy.
Welcome to Expats Everywhere. Can you tell us your name, where you're from, and a little bit about yourself?
Sure, Kalie. My name is Robert Nelson, and you can call me Bob. And I was born in the state of Wisconsin, raised in the state of Wyoming, and left after junior college to join the Air Force during the Vietnam War era, and was a disc jockey with Armed Forces Radio, just like Adrian Cronauer. And then went back to college, got a degree in radio and television, worked in the radio business as a news director for a couple of years, and then went into public relations, and then advertising for many years, and finally marketing, had a couple of vice president of marketing jobs, and then became a brand consultant at about the time I moved to Mexico in 2002. And lived in Puerto Vallarta, which was a place that I'd visited many, many, many times over the years since the first time that I went there in 1976. And in 2009, I moved back to California, to the Bay Area, where I had lived for some 30 years or so in the marketing business, and taught at San Jose State University as an advertising professor for I guess about a total of 10 years in the 90s, as well as from 2009 to 2013. And then we started, our first online magazine was called Adventures Abroad. Okay. And we kicked that off in 2013. But it was for basically a global audience. And we didn't really have the resources to make that really the success that we wanted. So we switched gears in 2016 as a good marketing person and focused on Mexico. And since I'd lived here for 7 years, it made a lot of sense because I knew a lot about Mexico. And then just in the last 2 months or so, my wife, Felice, and I moved back to Puerto Vallarta. And we're truly expats in Mexico now.
Oh, that's great. So have you been an expat anywhere else besides Mexico, or just lived in Mexico?
If you count being in the Air Force, being an expat, which I guess is one form of being an expat. I lived in Germany for 6 months, and I lived in Turkey for a year, and then I lived in Athens, Greece for a year and a half. But I've traveled internationally quite a bit over the years, and always loved traveling and always loved the expat life. And when I finally became an expat in 2002, it was actually quite a joyous experience.
So what drew you to Mexico?
Well, as I mentioned, I came for the first time in 1976 to Puerto Vallarta and absolutely fell in love with the place. I mean, what's not to love here? The mountains plunge into the Bay of Banderas, and it's sunshine 300 plus days a year, and the weather, particularly right now, is fantastic during the winter. And the people are fantastic. The cost of living is great. It's just a wonderful place to live.
Okay, great. So you mentioned that you're an expat in Mexico, and you have a company called Expats in Mexico. So tell us about that company.
Well, as I mentioned, it was a business that we started a little over 3 years ago, focusing specifically on Mexico, providing people who are interested in moving to Mexico with information that they could use to help them make the transition very easily. And also address the expats who already live in Mexico and provide them with information and a way to engage and get together and find a place that they could go to. And that's why we created an online magazine called Expats in Mexico, the guide to living in Mexico for expats. We have, as I said, over 3 years worth of content that we've developed. And interesting, what we do with expats in Mexico, which is very different than other online informational sources, is that virtually all of our information that we communicate through expats in Mexico is done through the voices of expats who live in Mexico. And occasionally we will interview people who are in the process of moving to Mexico also, just to get their perspective on what their motivation is for moving to Mexico and how they're going about doing it and so forth. So it's very instructive, I think, for people who are thinking about moving to Mexico, which is about 80% of our audience are people who are living in the United States or Canada or the United Kingdom or Australia or China. I mean, lots of different places. We have a very wide audience globally that can get information from what we call the horse's mouth, because the expats who live here are the ones who really tell their story about why they moved here and how they like living in the area, the cities that they're living in, what the cities are all about, what the cost of living is there, what their homes are like. So people really get an idea of what it's like living there.
Okay, great. And I've noticed on the website you've got several different tabs. Do you also blog as well, right?
Yes, we have a very large article section that, as I said, mainly are interviews that we've done with expats. Some articles are done on specific things like the environment and so forth. But we do a lot of research and create those articles. But we have a big blogging section also. We have over 400 blogs, and we have anywhere from 9 to a dozen bloggers at any given time that you can read, and they're from all over Mexico. We have bloggers from Cabo San Lucas, from San Miguel de Allende, from Puerto Vallarta, from Oaxaca, so all over Mexico, that expats who live in Mexico can give their very interesting and very specific information about the area that they live in, and they usually contribute on at least a monthly basis. Then we have a Mexico profile, which is 16 subsections that give you everything you need to know about Mexico. We have 12 or 13 of the most popular expat cities in Mexico that we profile, and there are like 10 subsections, and from climate to the cost of living, to lifestyle, to transportation that you can find locally, etc. Then we have a frequently asked questions section on the site, and a big immigration section that we keep updated. We have a lawyer, Diana Cuevas, who's a expat who lives in Merida, who keeps that up to date. So anyone who wants to know anything about immigrating to, or becoming an expat and getting a visa and coming here, has a lot of detail and information that they can get from our immigration section.
Great. And is the immigration section, does it focus mainly on Americans, or you said that you have everyone worldwide, so does it help with other countries as well?
Well, the immigration process is pretty similar for all countries. So the information is pretty general information in terms of whether you're applying in Pakistan or whether you're applying in Toronto. We're all pretty much the same. You go to the consulate, and then there's a very specific criteria that you have to meet and information you have to provide to get your visa, either a temporary visa or after 4 years, your permanent resident visa.
Okay, and have you found that the people that you help are mostly retiring to Mexico, or it's quite a mix?
It's very much of a mix. We have our main audience is between the age of 35 and up, including all the retired people too. Having said that, we also have a very large group of baby boomers who are beginning to retire. We do a research study once a year. In our last study that was done in January of this year, one of the things that we found was there's a very large uptick in the number of people from particularly the U.S. Baby boomers who are really seriously considering moving to Mexico. They're either planning or considering moving to Mexico, and that was very notable. That was a key finding from the research, that a lot of Americans are really thinking about moving to Mexico. And they're beginning to plan now. And a lot of them are moving now also. More people are moving into Mexico from the U.S. than are moving from Mexico to the U.S.
Okay, would you say that the process of moving is fairly easy?
I wouldn't say it's fairly easy, having just gone through the process.
Mm,
Um, whether you're moving, from one side of town to the other side of town, moving is not a fun thing to do,
right.
believe me. Uh, we did use each of my moves to Mexico and from Mexico, I've used an international moving company. And it makes things pretty easy doing it that way. But, I have to warn anyone who wants to use international moving companies, it isn't cheap. It's expensive to move to Mexico. So I always give the recommendation that if you're going to use an international moving company, if you have household goods that you really care about and you want to move with you, that you really do a good job of pruning. Go through that whole process of what can I buy down there that I can replace it with that will save me money shipping it down, because a lot of things down here are very, very nice. You can find wonderful furniture, wonderful accessories at a very, very reasonable price. And that's kind of what we did. We shipped core household things that we really wanted, like the large screen television set and so forth, because it's more expensive to buy electronics in Mexico than it is the U.S. So we did things like that. But as my mover told me, it's actually cheaper to move from San Francisco to London than it is from San Francisco to Mexico. So
Wow.
there are some regulations involved that drive the price up. So
Okay.
fair warning.
Good to know. So, a little bit about cost. You've talked about moving, but what about just a ballpark of cost of living while you're there?
Cost of living is a very personal decision. You can live the way you lived in the US or Canada or someplace else, or you can live like the people in Mexico live. We have people in Lake Chapala, which is a big retirement area, who live on $1,500 a month, basically a Social Security payment. There are a lot of people in the Chapala area who live on their Social Security and live just fine. They're paying $400, $500, $600 a month rent for a place. Some people have done a very good job of financial planning for their retirement, have actually very, very good incomes, buy very nice homes with views of the ocean and all of that. And, that is a very personal decision. We always say that when you're thinking about your cost of living for Mexico, what you have to really think about is what kind of lifestyle you want to lead.
Mm.
And I would say, for example, in Puerto Vallarta, that you could easily live in $3,000 a month in Puerto Vallarta. The rental prices of homes have gone up quite a bit over the last few years, so it's not as inexpensive as if you went into some of the interior cities. San Miguel de Allende is a more expensive city. Puerto Vallarta, Los Cabos, all the international resort areas are very popular areas. But if you go to Oaxaca, you go to Guanajuato, some of the interior colonial cities, cost of living is very, very reasonable.
Okay, and I think that a question that is always on people's mind is safety. So, is Mexico safe?
Well, that's interesting, because if you live in the United States or Canada, the headlines every time a cartel gets into a battle tends to dominate the news. And expats who live in Mexico will tell you that Mexico is a much safer place than the media portrays Mexico. One of the things that is important to remember and know about Mexico is that the violence in Mexico tends to be very regional in nature. The state of Sinaloa, which is the home of the Sinaloa cartel, can be, in many areas of Sinaloa, very dangerous. The Culiacan, the capital of Sinaloa, is a very dangerous place. The border cities the border cities with Mexico, with the transit of illegal drugs into the United States from Mexico, can be very dangerous. Some areas in some states in the south part of Mexico, like the state of Guerrero, for example, which is Acapulco, can be a very dangerous area. The state of Michoacan has a history of lots of violence and problems also. But most areas that the cities that expats tend to favor are very safe. Merida, for example, in the capital of the Yucatan, is the safest large city in Mexico, and that's attracting a lot of expats.
Okay. And a question that we like to ask expat businesses, because this comes up a lot with our comments in the comment sections of our videos, is, in your opinion, what is an expat?
Well, it's interesting. I wrote a book a few years ago called Adventures Abroad, the New American Expat Generation, and researched this pretty thoroughly. And, you know, the idea of expats wasn't really talked about until the 1920s. That's when Hemingway and Fitzgerald and all those people went to Paris back in the 1920s. They called themselves expatriates. But expatriates it was kind of a negative term back then, you know, people who were disloyal to their country. But by the mid part of the 20th century, when internationalism became, after World War II, became more important as companies began to develop their businesses in other countries around the world, it was the rise of the corporate expat. And then that became a more popular idea. But today, we really consider a expat to be someone living abroad permanently or for a specific period of time for a wide range of reasons. That's how we define an expat.
Okay, so pretty broad, right?
Pretty broad, absolutely.
Okay, great. Lastly, Bob, thanks so much for the interview. If our viewers want to get in touch with you, ask questions about Mexico, check out your website, how can they contact you?
Well, they could first of all go to our website, which is www.expatsinmexico.com. We have a way to communicate on there, our contact section, which is info@expatsinmexico.com, and that's probably the best way for them to get in touch. But we welcome that. I get probably at least 2 or 3 emails a day from someone. I just got one this morning from someone who said, I'm 81 years old and I'm thinking about moving to Mexico. You know, what's it like? And you know, can I live on this amount of income? And, you know, we're happy to respond to that or give them links back to our site that have specific articles that would be helpful for them. So, yeah, that's where we like to interact with our readers.
Great. Well, thanks so much for chatting with Expats Everywhere today.
Thank you, Kalie. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.